Chinese is kind of looking up to the Western education system and they are getting westernized, but it's not like they're taking everything. There's a lot of criticism going on in Chinese education that they think is a lot of indoctrination. You basically just teach the kids a lot of things and you don't teach them critical thinking. But nowadays in middle schools, teachers started to focus more on critical thinking. In China, we actually do not have the concept of elite. It's stressful because in the mainland, we have a system, we call it Gaokao, and you really only have that one chance to try to get into the university. So it's actually a really fair system that your financial background, or if you are born in a very famous family, does not matter at all. So it's very competitive. Both countries are pretty ignorant towards each other. But what's fun is that Americans see China in a negative way, but Chinese usually see America in a pretty positive way. Yes, a lot of people are criticizing don't get to elect those government officials, which is also pretty wrong. But the thing is, like, when you look at the evidence, when you look at what progress China has made, they really put people at first. The ultimate goal of democracy is the well-being of each individual as a distinct and significant humanity. So you can ask any American, okay, you have democracy, but have you achieved the goal? You think you really enjoy your democracy?
Welcome to the 6th episode of SOFTtalk, where unlike BBC's Hard Talk, the interviewees won't find it hard to talk. Before we start, please remember to subscribe to our channel by pressing the red button below, like the video by giving a thumbs up, and also share the video with your friends and family members.
So today we have a guest from China. Her name is Christine, and she is currently studying at Xi'an Jiaotong Daxue, which is one of the most prominent and renowned universities in China.
So Christine, can you please briefly introduce yourself to our audience?
Yeah, sure. My name is Christine. I study economics at Xi'an Jiaotong University in Xi'an, and I'm a senior now. I spent the last year at University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. My academic interests are among inequality, social welfare, and public policies. So before we started, I just want to mention that I'm really just a student, that I'm still actively learning. So my mind is pretty open for changes, and I'm not an expert at all in either politics or international relations.
So now let's move on to the first question of today's interview. So Christine, could you tell us a bit about how a typical day in the life of a student at a Chinese university would look like? Is academic pressure and competition very fierce at Xijiaoda?
Let me start with academic pressure. So I think as everyone knows that high school and also middle school in China, in mainland, is really competitive, really stressful. My friends, when they were in high school, they went to school at like 6 a.m. in the morning and then they study all day. They get back at 11 p.m. It's stressful because in the mainland, we have a system, we call it Gaokao, and you really only have that one chance to try to get into the university. So it's actually a really fair system that your financial background, or if you are born in a very famous family, does not matter at all. It's very competitive. And once you step into the university, everything changes because now you left your family. A lot of students actually just started to fall in love with video games, and then they deviate from academic life. Academic life in university is also pretty competitive. It's not really more relaxed than high school because job market in China is pretty stressful, so you really gotta study really hard.
Thank you very much. So having lived in both the US and China as a university student, how would you characterize your perception of Chinese university students and their American counterparts? What are the most obvious differences? Do you prefer studying in the US or in China? And are the styles of teaching different?
In China, we actually do not have the concept of elite. When you're in the US, you hear people talk a lot about Ivy League. So in China, we also have C9, which is kind of like the Chinese version of Ivy League, but it's very fair and affordable. When I was in the US, I heard a lot of people have student loans because the tuition is really high, but I've never seen even one Chinese student, if you want to live in the dorm, which most people do, and it's also really cheap. It's more or less like $100 a year, but you have to share a room with other people. In Chinese university, that we have much more classes. We usually start classes at 8 a.m., which is pretty early. And then sometimes we have evening classes from 7 p.m. to 9. When I was at Penn, every semester I have 4 to 5 classes, but when I was in China, I could have like 9, 10, 11, or even 12 classes. In China, it's also compulsory for all the students to learn English. So we have the CET, College English Test, and all students have to pass the level 4 before graduation. So English language is actually a requirement for graduation in China. Chinese kind of looking up to the Western education system and they are getting westernized, but it's not like they are taking everything. I think they are sort of learning, incorporating it in the original Chinese systems. There's a lot of criticism going on in Chinese education that this thing is a lot of indoctrination. You basically just teach the kids a lot of things and you don't teach them critical thinking. But nowadays in middle schools, teachers started to focus more on critical thinking. 2 months ago in Hong Kong, there was middle school final exam on history and they asked the student to critically analyze the impact of Sino-Japanese War. It became a pretty controversial thing in the mainland because no pros for war. They bring us a lot of negative things and it just shows that the education system in Hong Kong is very different from the mainland. It makes the students think in a different way.
That's very interesting. So now let's move on to the next question. So Westerners have certain prejudices or stereotypes regarding how life is like in China. For instance, they may think that civil discourse is very illiberal or it is heavily censored, while some others may think that the Chinese people are rude or blunt in their daily interactions. So are these prejudices true or false, and to what extent?
I think there are a lot of misunderstanding and misperception from both sides. When I was young, what we've taught is that the Westerners are all pretty polite. They have better qualities than Chinese, so we have to really look up to them. Especially one very interesting story is that I remember clearly. It's probably like 10 years ago. A lot of people don't really care about the traffic rules. And then in China, people say that, oh, those Westerners, those Americans, they follow the rules and why can't you? And then last year when I was in London, I found out that nobody really care about the traffic light at all, just cross the road. So it's really something that we were taught, but it's actually wrong. Another thing that is actually really famous is that all the Chinese parents and students that they think American universities are very easy to get in, but it's very hard to graduate from it because it's very challenging. But after I went there, I found out the truth is actually very easy to get in when you are rich, and it's very hard to graduate when you are a spoiled kid. Both countries are pretty ignorant towards each other. But what's funny is that Americans see China in a negative way, but Chinese usually see America in a pretty positive way. I think it's because of American soft power. So they really impacted the way Chinese think. At least that's before the COVID pandemic. Definitely more and more people are shifting their thoughts. For Americans, start by how China look. So if you've ever been to a Chinatown in European country or America, you will notice that Chinatown is nowhere look like China. It's mostly like China, but 30 or 40 years ago, maybe more like Hong Kong than the mainland. I think that made some Americans think, oh, maybe Chinatown is really what China looks like. Very major prejudice is that they tend not to believe anything said by China or the Chinese government. They take everything as a propaganda. A video like showing really nice Chinese countryside that posted by CNN on Instagram. In the comments section, you'll see those top comments to be, how much did China pay to you to post this? Secondly, that they believe the Chinese have all been brainwashed because there are 1.4 billion of Chinese people and they all follow the CCP rule, and they think that the government is actively, consistently brainwashing people. Third, that they view communism as the ultimate evil without even understand what it actually means. They never really looked into Marxist theory or anything related. I'm not saying which system or which theory is better. I'm not a philosopher, but I'm just saying that really don't know what it means, but they just take it as evil because that's what they learned when they were young.
So are Americans and also Westerners quite open-minded towards the Chinese way of life? Or is it sometimes difficult for you to deal with their stereotypical prejudices when you're going to have a chat with them, especially in regards to Chinese politics or maybe controversial topics such as human rights?
So for democracy, human rights, and free speech, those three things I heard it repeatedly when I was in the US. And there's a question like, what is human rights? What is democracy? And what is the goal of these things? The ultimate goal of democracy is the well-being of each individual as a distinct, significant humanity. So you can ask any American, okay, you have democracy, but have you achieved the goal? Do you think you really enjoy your democracy? I think Chinese people have a very different thoughts on democracy. I think that democracy is when the government always has the interests of people in mind when they make any decision. The government serves the people. The government put the people in the first. Yes, a lot of people are criticizing to elect those government officials, which is also pretty wrong. But the thing is, like, when you look at the evidence, when you look at what progress China has made, they really put people at first. China 40 years ago was a really poor country. 60 years ago, China is extremely poor. Like the average salary per person is below $100 a year. Just 40, 60 years. China has brought almost 1 billion people out of poverty. Core of the Chinese democracy is really people-oriented. Government to act benefit the people the most. You really should go and ask people how satisfied they are with their government. So in the US, I'm pretty sure like maybe only 30% of the people will say that they are satisfied with their government. But if you're in China, I can guarantee that number is above like 80%, especially after the pandemic, that people are actually feeling more satisfied and confident about Chinese system. Another thing about human rights, it seems like Americans define human rights as only the freedom of speech. And there's a lot of aspects about human rights, like safety, opportunity. There's a word called upward mobility. If you can be richer than your parents.
So this marks the end of part 1. In part 2, we will be talking about Chinese society, so make sure to stay tuned.
All right, see you in the next part. Bye.